My sister lost her job and expected me to cover her expenses, but when I said no, she reacted in a way that ruined our relationship forever. Thanksgiving has always been a chaotic event in my family. Every year I tell myself it will be different, that perhaps this time things won't spiral into a mess of blame and guilt, but every year I find myself proven wrong. This Thanksgiving was no different. I arrived at my parents' house around 3:00 p.m., clutching a bottle of wine and mentally preparing myself to just get through it. My mom was busy in the kitchen preparing her usual extravagant holiday feast. My dad was watching the game, and my sister Emily and her husband Abraham were sitting on the couch, glued to their phones. The atmosphere was peaceful, at least for the first hour. Dinner itself was fantastic. My mom's cooking never fails to impress. We had turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and all the traditional sides. For about 45 minutes, I truly thought this Thanksgiving might go off without any drama. But as soon as the dishes were cleared, my dad leaned back in his chair, signaling that the conversation was about to take a turn. He looked directly at me and said, "Your sister and Abraham are having some problems." I immediately knew where this was headed. I had heard it all before. Emily and Abraham, who got married last year at 19, are both unemployed, struggling, financially and buried in bills. My parents have been helping them out for months, paying for rent, groceries, and everything else. Apparently, their financial struggles had become a full-time job for my parents, and now they were looking to me to pick up the slack. "We've already done so much," my mom said. "We raised you, paid for your wedding, helped you with your house, but now it's time for you to step up. You're the one with a stable job and no kids. Their family needs you." I stared at her, processing what I had just heard. I wasn't surprised by the request, but I was shocked at how casually they said it, as if it was an unquestionable fact. I tried to remain calm. "I don't know, Mom. I have my own bills to pay. I can't just start supporting two people out of nowhere." That set them off. For almost 2 hours, my parents berated me about how selfish I was, how I never helped out, and how they were tired of doing everything for Emily and Abraham while I just watched. The worst part? Emily and Abraham didn't say a word. Not once did they speak up. They just sat there, letting my parents do all the fighting for them. It was as if they expected me to cave. Eventually, I didn't argue or yell. I just let them talk, waiting until I could no longer bear it. When I had had enough, I stood up, thanked them for dinner, and said I had to leave. My mom immediately became emotional, trying to convince me not to leave in anger, but I didn't even turn around. I grabbed my coat, walked to my car, and drove home. The silence on the drive back was the first moment of peace I had all night, but of course that wasn't the end. The next morning, my phone began ringing nonstop. My parents called repeatedly, asking what I had decided about helping Emily and Abraham. They didn't ask if I was okay after the argument, or apologize for springing this on me at Thanksgiving. They just wanted to know how much I was going to contribute to their cause. Part of me wanted to ignore them, but instead, I gave them an answer I hoped would finally put an end to it. "Fine," I said. "I'll help you. Come by my place Thursday morning and I'll take care of it." They were ecstatic, probably, imagining I'd write Emily and Abraham a big check or agree to pay their bills long term. But that wasn't my plan. What I had in mind wouldn't cost me a single penny, but it would definitely make a difference. Thursday morning arrived, and my parents, Emily and Abraham, showed up right on time. I could sense their relief even before they walked in. My mom was carrying a tray of cookies. My dad had that smug look on his face, and Emily and Abraham wore awkward, half-hearted smiles, trying to appear grateful but clearly unsure of what to say. "Thanks for having us over," my mom said. "It means a lot to see you stepping up like this." I nodded and let her believe whatever she wanted. Once everyone was settled in the living room, I dropped the bombshell. "So, here's what I did," I said. "I booked a 3-hour session with a family therapist. He's fantastic. He's helped some of my friends work through tough issues, and I think this is exactly what we need to work through our problems." The room fell into stunned silence. "A therapist?" my dad finally muttered. "Yeah," I replied. "Look, this whole thing, the fighting, the blaming, the finger-pointing, it's just making everything worse. We need to sit down and figure this out, and a therapist can help us do that." My mom's face turned red. "You booked a therapist for us?" she asked incredulously. "Exactly," I said. "The session's in about 30 minutes. My dad stood up, his face turning angry. "We didn't come here for that. We thought you wanted to help Emily and Abraham financially." I shrugged. "I am helping. This is the help you all need." They didn't take it well. My dad went off ranting about how I was wasting their time, and my mom looked like she was about to cry. After several minutes of heated back and forth, they stormed out, slamming the door behind them. I was left with Emily and Abraham. They didn't seem any happier than my parents, but they didn't leave either. "So what now?" Emily asked, her voice dripping with irritation. "Well," I said. You two stay for the session. You've got bigger problems than just not having enough money. You're married and already relying on everyone else to take care of you. That's not a sustainable way to live. Abraham finally spoke up. We're trying, man. It's just hard. Jobs are tough to find and the rent is crazy. I get it, I said. But getting married at 19 and expecting the world to bail you out, that's a choice you made. Now you have to figure out how to deal with it. They both looked uncomfortable, but to their credit, they didn't argue. When the therapist arrived, they went through with the session. I stayed mostly out of it, letting the therapist guide them through their issues. They discussed their financial struggles, their lack of a plan, and how they'd been relying too much on my parents. The therapist didn't pull any punches. He later told them they needed to take responsibility for their own lives and start working toward independence. By the end of the session, they looked drained, but a little more aware of their situation. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd start making changes. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. After the session, Emily and Abraham left without saying much. They didn't seem angry, but they definitely weren't thankful either. I thought that was the end of it, at least for the day. But I was wrong. The next morning, my mom called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. How could you? She said as soon as I picked up. Good morning to you too, I replied. She launched into a tirade about how I'd humiliated the family by bringing in a therapist. She accused me of making things worse and claimed I was the reason Emily and Abraham were upset and feeling lost. I told her that was nonsense and hung. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Emily. Can we talk? Just us. I need to tell you something. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I agreed. She came over alone, which was surprising. Abraham was usually glued to her side. She seemed uneasy as she sat down, and after a few moments of small talk, she blurted out, "Abraham's in trouble." I braced myself and asked, "What kind of trouble?" She hesitated, then quietly said, "He hasn't been trying to find a job. Not at all. He's been gambling." I just stared at her, stunned. This wasn't what I had expected. Gambling, I finally managed to say. How much? A lot, she replied softly. That's why we're behind on the rent and he's been borrowing money from people. I didn't even know about it until a few weeks ago, but now these people are threatening him. I was in shock. Suddenly everything made sense. The constant financial struggles, the way Abraham always had an excuse for not working. It all clicked. "Emily, this is insane," I said. "You're 19, married to a guy who gambles, away your rent money, and now you're dragging mom, dad, and me into this mess." She started crying. I know it's bad, but I don't know how to fix it. He promised he'd stop, but then he didn't, and now it's just a disaster." I took a deep breath and tried to think. Does Abraham know you're telling me this? I asked. No, she admitted. He'd be furious if he knew. At that moment, I realized there was no way out of this without things getting messy. All right, I said. Here's what we're going to do. You have to tell mom and dad the truth. All of it. If they're going to continue helping you, they need to know what's really going on. And Abraham, he needs to get his act together. Therapy, whatever it takes. If he doesn't, you need to seriously rethink your choices. Emily nodded, but I could tell she wasn't happy with the idea. The next day, she told my parents the truth. As expected, they exploded. My dad was furious, my mom was hysterical, and Abraham wasn't pleased either. He called me that night, accusing me of betraying him by stirring up trouble. I told him he had no one to blame but himself. The real surprise came a few days later. I got a call from an unknown number. When I answered, a man on the other end said, "Hey, I'm looking for Abraham. He owes me $3,000, and if he doesn't pay, we're going to have a problem." I immediately hung up and called Emily. She broke down and admitted she hadn't known how bad things had gotten. Apparently, Abraham owed money to several people, and they were all starting to close in. I was done being patient. I called a lawyer friend for advice. Then I sat down with Emily and Abraham and told them they needed to get their act together quickly. I helped them set up a payment plan and connected them with organizations that could assist with addiction recovery, but the threats didn't stop. A week later, someone left a note on my parents' car, warning them to pay up or face consequences. That was the tipping point for my parents. They stopped helping Emily and Abraham and told them they were on their own. Emily called me crying and begging for help, but I refused. I tried to help, I told her. You have to fix this yourself now. I haven't heard from them since, but occasionally I wonder what kind of mess they're dealing with now. As for me, I've finally learned my lesson. Sometimes walking away really is the best thing you can do. After weeks of avoiding calls and ignoring texts, I thought maybe Emily and Abraham had finally decided to figure things out on their own. But, of course, that was just wishful thinking. One morning, as I was about to head out for work, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Emily and Abraham standing there looking exhausted and desperate. "We need to talk," Emily said. I didn't have the energy to argue. Fine, 5 minutes, I replied. They came in, and Abraham immediately started pleading. Look, I know things have been bad and I've messed up, but we're in serious trouble. I need $1,500 to settle up with one of the guys I owe money to. If I can pay him, he'll back off and we can start over. I just stared at them both, dumbfounded. You've got to be kidding me. After everything, you still think I'm going to bail you out? Please, Emily said. This is the last time. We swear. I didn't buy it for a second, but despite wanting to tell them to leave, I couldn't ignore the fact that the guy Abraham owed money to wasn't bluffing. I'd already seen the note on my parents' car, and I didn't want things to escalate any further. I sighed and said, all right, here's the deal. I'll give you $2,500 one time, but that's it. After that, I don't want to hear from either of you. No calls, no texts, nothing. You're on your own from now on. Got it? They nodded eagerly, as though I'd just given them a life-changing gift. I transferred the money to Emily's account right then and there. It wasn't that I felt sorry for them. I just wanted them gone. $2,500 seemed like a small price to pay for peace of mind. Thank you, Emily said as they left. You have no idea how much this means to us. I didn't respond. I just closed the door and went about my day, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. A few months have passed, and they've mostly kept their word. I haven't heard from Emily or Abraham since that day. My parents still grumble about how I abandoned my sister, but even they stopped trying to guilt me into going back. Do I regret giving them the money? Not at all. It was worth every penny to get my sanity back. Sometimes the easiest way to solve a problem is to pay them off and walk away. But if they ever show up again, I'm done. This time, they'll be met with a locked door and silence. Let someone else play the hero. I'm officially out of the game. It didn't take long for things to spiral again. A few weeks after I gave Emily and Abraham the $2,500, I got a call from my mother. Your sister told me you helped her out, she said. She said that was very generous of you. We had no idea you had that kind of money lying around. I sighed. What are you getting at, Mom? Well, she continued, if $2,500 isn't a big deal to you, maybe you could help us with the mortgage this month. Things have been tight. I almost dropped the phone. Are you serious? You think I'm just handing out money left and right now? She didn't even flinch. It's just a little help. And honestly, if you have that kind of cushion, why aren't you doing more for Emily and Abraham? They're still struggling, you know? That was it for me. I cut her off in mid-sentence. Mom, let me get this straight. The $2,500 I gave them was a one-time deal, and it's not happening again. As for you and Dad, you're grown-ups. Figure out your own finances. I'm done being your backup plan. She stammered something about how selfish I was, but I hung up before she could finish. A few days later, Emily texted me asking for more money. I didn't even reply. Abraham called me twice, leaving voicemails about how I was family and needed to step up. I just deleted them. The tipping point came when my father called and demanded to know where I was getting the money. If you can afford it, why don't you help us more? He asked, as if I owed him an explanation. I laughed. You think I'm some kind of ATM now? Guess what? I'm not. And if you keep calling me about this, I'm going to cut you all off. And that's exactly what I did. I stopped answering their calls, blocked their numbers, and ignored the endless stream of messages. At first, it felt harsh, but as time passed, I began to breathe easier. A few weeks later, I took things a step further. I adopted a massive Rottweiler from a local shelter. His name was Max, and he looked like the kind of dog you'd want to avoid. Huge, muscular, and always scowling. I wasn't really a dog person, but I figured Max would be a perfect deterrent if my family ever showed up uninvited. Plus, once you looked past his intimidating exterior, he was surprisingly sweet. The first time Emily tried to drop by unannounced, Max barked so loudly that she turned around and left before I even opened the door. I watched her practically sprint back to her car, laughing until my stomach ached. It's been a year now, and I haven't heard a word from any of them. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits. Max and I are doing great on our own. Honestly, I wish I'd cut them off sooner. It wasn't easy, but it was the best thing I ever did for myself. Sometimes you have to protect your peace, even if it means getting a massive, fierce dog to keep the chaos away. Life has been quiet, and I like it that way. My mornings now start with coffee on the porch, with Max stretched out next to me, keeping watch like the loyal protector he is. I've thrown myself into work, picked up hobbies I had neglected, and even started traveling on weekends. As for my family, I hear bits and pieces through mutual friends. Emily and Abraham are still struggling, though I've heard Abraham finally got a part-time job. My parents, as far as I know, are still trying to manage their finances, but at least they're no longer dragging me into it. Every now and then, I think back to Thanksgiving, to the years I spent trying to please people who only saw me as a tool for their own benefit. I don't feel anger anymore, I feel relief. Relief that I finally set boundaries and stuck to them. Max has become my unofficial sidekick. People who meet him always comment on how intimidating he looks, but they don't see how he sneaks onto the couch when I'm not looking, or how his tail wags when I grab his leash. He's the perfect reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The best part? I no longer live in fear of my family showing up or calling to demand more. They know where they stand, and so do I. I didn't just buy my peace with that 1,500, I earned it. And if anyone tries to take it away from me again, they'll have to go through Max first.